What if I told you that everything you feel is controlled by her? Without even realizing it. You may even think you've moved on from your past. That it was left behind, buried in childhood. But what if I told you that an invisible part of your mother is still living inside of you, influencing your choices, your relationships, and even the way you see yourself? It may sound strong, but this is one of the most ignored truths when we talk about emotional trauma and emotional healing. Most people go their entire lives without realizing that they repeat the same patterns, sabotaging themselves, canceling themselves out, seeking validation where they never find it. And all of this can be linked to the so-called mother complex, a concept explored by Carl Jung, which shows how our childhood wounds remain active through unconscious patterns. The most curious? This happens even if your relationship with your mother was normal. But here's the twist: you don't have to keep stuck with it. There is a path of healing the inner child, working with the shadow and developing self-love that can lead you to true psychological freedom. But for that, you will need to see what most people avoid. And throughout this video, you will understand exactly how this influence works. And, above all, how to start breaking the cycle. You know that feeling that everything you feel today is the fault of someone back there, especially your mother? Well, this seems to make sense at first. But over time, you begin to realize that the real impact is not only in what happened, but in how your mind organized that experience. That's where the so-called unconscious patterns come in, which shape your reactions without you even realizing it. Within psychology, especially in Carl Jung's ideas, there is the notion that we are not only victims of the past, but also active participants in the way it lives on within us. The mother complex, for example, is not about blaming your mother directly, but about understanding how this relationship was internalized. And this completely changes the game of emotional healing. It's as if you were given an emotional script in childhood, full of childhood wounds and possible traces of self-abandonment, and now you are living on autopilot. The good news? You can rewrite this script. But before that, comes an uncomfortable step: stop looking outside and start observing what is happening inside. And that makes room for something deeper. As you will see in the next point. Even if your mother is no longer physically present or until your relationship is distant, her influence lives on within you. And it's not in a light symbolic way, no. It is something deep, rooted in your unconscious. This presence shapes thoughts, emotions, and even decisions, often without you realizing it. This is where the mother complex begins to gain strength. According to Carl Jung, parental figures do not disappear over time, they become internal structures. That is, that voice that criticizes you, that demands too much from you, or even that makes you doubt yourself. It may not be exactly yours. This is one of the most striking aspects of unconscious patterns, which sustain cycles of self-abandonment and hinder psychological freedom. A simple exercise to start noticing this throughout the day: observe your automatic thoughts. When you make a mistake, for example, what comes to mind? A harsh criticism? A heavy judgment? Ask yourself, is this voice really mine, or did I learn it from someone else? This type of awareness is the first step in the process of inner child healing, and also the beginning of something even deeper that we will explore next. Now we enter a central point of all this: the famous maternal complex. In Carl Jung's view, this is not just an abstract idea, it is an unconscious emotional pattern that directly influences how you feel, react, and relate. It's like an invisible filter that distorts your perception of reality, especially in the most intimate bonds. This complex can manifest itself in many ways: excessive need for approval, fear of rejection, difficulty in setting limits, or even emotional dependence. All of this is born from childhood wounds that have not been processed and end up repeating themselves as unconscious patterns. And the most curious? You may think you're making rational decisions, but deep down, it's this pattern that's in charge. A practical step here is to start identifying your emotional triggers. For example, when someone ignores or criticizes you, is their reaction disproportionate? Do you feel an old, almost childlike pain? This can be a clear sign of the mother complex at work. Recognizing this is not weakness, it is the beginning of shadow work and true emotional healing, which begins when you see what was once invisible. Maybe you think you're still conflicted with your mother. But, to be very direct, the real battle is not with her. It's with the image that stayed inside you. A kind of emotional ghost that remains active, influencing your choices, your fears, and even your self-esteem. This is one of the quietest effects of the mother complex. According to Carl Jung, when we don't integrate certain emotional contents, they don't disappear, they become internal forces that control us. That's where shadow work comes in, recognizing that this internal struggle is not against a real person, but against a psychological standard. And as long as this is not seen, you continue to react on automatic, trapped in unconscious patterns. A very common example: you feel constantly judged, even when no one is really criticizing you. Or else they are always trying to prove their worth all the time, as if they were being evaluated. This is not about the present, it is about an old war that has not yet been ended. And facing this, as uncomfortable as it may be, is an essential step towards psychological freedom. Because at the next point, you'll realize that this image doesn't just stay inside you, it projects itself into the world around you. Now comes an important turn: this internal image of the mother does not stay only within you. It begins to leak out. You start to project this archetype onto other people, partners, bosses, friends, hoping, without realizing it, to receive from them what was missing back then. This is one of the most powerful mechanisms of the unconscious patterns linked to the mother complex. According to Carl Jung, projection is when you attribute content to the other that is actually yours. So, for example, you might expect a partner to give you constant validation, or a boss to recognize your every effort. As if, deep down, he was trying to heal old childhood wounds. And when this does not happen, frustration comes with force, sometimes even disproportionate. A practical exercise here is to observe your patterns in relationships. Ask yourself, what do I expect from this person? Is this fair, or am I trying to fill an old void? This type of reflection makes room for inner child healing and strengthens self-love, because you begin to take emotional responsibility. And, little by little, you realize that the problem is not only in the people you choose, but in the route that leads you to them, something we'll delve into in the next point. If you dig deep enough, you'll realize that this all starts way back in the so-called childhood wounds. It may have been a lack of affection, rejection, emotional absence, or even an excess of control. It doesn't have to be something serious in the eyes of others. What matters is how you felt. And these experiences shape the mother complex and create unconscious patterns that you carry to this day. In Carl Jung's view, the child does not have the structure to interpret these situations rationally. So she adapts. She learns to please, to shut up, to annul herself. And then self-abandonment is born. This mechanism becomes an automatic pattern in adult life, affecting your self-esteem, your choices, and even your ability to live with psychological freedom. A practical path here is to start revisiting your story more honestly but without judgment. Writing about remarkable moments in childhood, identifying emotions that still hurt, or even looking for readings like The Drama of the Well-Endowed Child by Alice Miller can open your eyes. This is a powerful step in inner child healing and emotional healing. Because when you understand the root, you begin to realize that there is still something holding you back and that it needs to be finally released in the next step. Here comes one of the hardest truths to accept, and at the same time, one of the most liberating. Emotional healing doesn't start when your mother changes. It starts when you stop waiting for it to happen. As long as this silent expectation exists, you remain trapped in the mother complex, as if your emotional life still depends on something that is out of your control. From Carl Jung's perspective, maturing psychologically involves taking responsibility for one's own internal history. This does not mean ignoring what happened, but rather stopping outsourcing your healing. Because, deep down, this constant waiting keeps the unconscious patterns alive and reinforces the cycle of self-abandonment, as if you were saying, "I will only be okay when the other changes." A powerful exercise: write a letter which you don't have to send, saying everything you wish your mother had done or said. Then read it carefully and ask, how can I start offering this to myself today? This movement activates self-love and initiates a real process of inner child healing. And when that key turns, you start to leave the waiting place and enters a territory where something deeper has yet to be faced: the patterns that keep repeating themselves. Hey, race a point that usually surprises a lot of people. At some point, without realizing it, you start acting exactly like what hurt you. It seems contradictory, right? But that's how unconscious patterns work. The mother complex doesn't just influence how you feel, it also shapes how you behave, often repeating what once hurt you. In Carl Jung's view, that which is not conscious manifests itself as destiny. In other words, unresolved emotional trauma becomes an automatic action. You can see this when you find yourself being yourself, overly demanding, or even emotionally unavailable with other people. It's as if, unintentionally, you are acting out the same script as your childhood wounds. A practical step here is to develop mindful pauses. When you notice an automatic reaction in inner criticism, an overdemand, and emotional withdrawal, stop and ask yourself, is this really who I am, or is it a learned pattern? This type of awareness is essential in shadow work and makes room for true emotional healing. Because when you see the pattern, you get the chance to stop it. But this comes with an emotional cost that few are prepared to face, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about next. There comes a time in this process when you realize something hard: the past is not going to change. Childhood doesn't come back, the words you needed may never be spoken. And that hurts. This is the so-called mourning of illusion. And, as uncomfortable as it may be, it is an essential stage of emotional healing and liberation from the mother complex. According to Carl Jung, psychological growth requires letting go of fantasies that keep us trapped. The hope that one day everything will be solved may seem comforting, but it also feeds unconscious patterns and prolongs self-abandonment. Because, deep down, you keep putting off your own psychological freedom, waiting for something that may never come. A powerful exercise here is to allow yourself to feel without running away. Sadness, anger, frustration. This is all part of the process. Writing, talking to someone you trust, or even seeking therapy can help you go through this grief more consciously. This is a profound step in inner child healing and shadow work. Because when the illusion falls, there is something real left. And that's exactly what you'll need to face in the next point. Now comes something even more subtle and often shocking when you realize it. There's a kind of invisible loyalty that keeps you stuck in your mother's story. As if, unconsciously, you believe that growing, healing, or being happier than her was a form of betrayal. This is one of the deepest aspects of the mother complex. In Carl Jung's perspective, these unconscious bonds create internal blocks that sabotage your evolution. You may even desire psychological freedom, work on your self-love, and seek emotional healing, but something inside you pulls you back. This manifests itself in decisions that limit you, in cycles that repeat themselves, and even in a certain discomfort when things start to work out. An important exercise here is to honestly ask yourself, is there any part of me that feels guilty for wanting more, for living better, or for doing differently? If the answer is yes, you are touching a crucial point of shadow work. Recognizing this loyalty is the first step to freeing yourself from it. Because, at the next point, you will realize that this prison does not only come from the outside, it also manifests itself in the way you treat yourself every day. Here is one of the quietest and most painful consequences of this whole process: self-abandonment. At some point, you learn that your emotions weren't a priority. Perhaps they were not heard, validated, or welcomed. And then you did what any child would do: adapt. The problem is that this pattern continues into adulthood, feeding the mother complex and reinforcing old unconscious patterns. In practice, this appears in very common ways. You demand too much of yourself, ignore what you feel, criticize yourself harshly, or always put yourself in the background. It is as if there is an inner voice that invalidates their pains, often echoing old childhood wounds. And this takes you further and further away from emotional healing and the much-desired psychological freedom, keeping alive a cycle that seems to have no end. An essential step here is to start practicing micro-acts of presence with yourself. Simple but powerful things. Stop for a few minutes a day to identify what you're feeling, write without filters, or even ask yourself, what do I need right now? This type of practice strengthens inner child healing and self-love. Because, little by little, you stop abandoning yourself and starts building something new within yourself, which is exactly what we'll explore in the next point. After all this, you begin to realize that the real turning point is not in changing the past, but in rebuilding who you are from it. Becoming your own emotional foundation is the opposite of self-abandonment. It's consciously assuming the role you once lacked. And this does not happen all at once, but through small daily decisions that dissolve the mother complex. In Carl Jung's view, this process is part of the path of individuation when you stop living by unconscious patterns and start acting consciously. This involves developing self-love, practicing shadow work, and continuing the process of inner child healing. It's not about becoming perfect, but about becoming whole. In practice, this can start with simple things: setting limits without guilt, validating your emotions, taking care of your emotional routine as you would take care of someone you love. Readings like The Courage to Be Imperfect by Brené Brown can help, as can therapy or reflective writing practices. This is the path of emotional healing and true psychological freedom. Because when you become your own base, you finally begin to break the cycle. Now tell me sincerely, how many of your choices were really yours? And how many were guided by standards that you never questioned? To what extent does the mother complex still influence your emotions, your relationships, and the way you treat yourself on a daily basis? These are not easy questions, but they are exactly what pave the way for emotional healing and true psychological freedom. What if, starting today, you started to observe yourself more consciously? To identify your unconscious patterns, welcome your childhood wounds, and interrupt cycles of self-abandonment? It doesn't have to be perfect, it doesn't have to be fast, it just needs to be honest. Because each small step towards self-love and inner child healing is already a movement of transformation in itself. Now I want to make you an invitation. You will keep repeating the same story? Or will you decide to break the cycle? If this content made sense to you, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. Because here, we don't just understand the mind, we learn to free ourselves from it.